Hi, everybody. Welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's biweekly webcast on fiscal policy for the COVID-19 economy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, a senior fellow at TPC and editor of our blog, TaxVox. Our guest today is Marc Goldwein, Senior Vice President and Senior Policy Director for the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. Marc served as Associate Director of the Bowles-Simpson National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, and later was Senior Budget Analyst on the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction. Marc teaches economics at the University of California, DC, and at Johns Hopkins University. Before we begin, just a bit of housekeeping. We encourage audience members to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. This event's being recorded and will be posted online at TPC's website. And if you'd like to join in the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. Finally, if you'd like to suggest a future guest for The Prescription, just email us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. Marc Goldwein, welcome to The Prescription. Good to have you. Our timing is perfect. The House has passed and the Senate is about to begin debate on President Biden's $1.9 trillion pandemic relief plan. You've criticized the plan for being too big and for including provisions that have no relation to pandemic relief. So let's start at the top. What should be in this bill and how big should it be?
It's pretty clear to me that we still need more economic relief. We are not out of this pandemic. In the economy, there's still 10 million people at least that are out of work. But we don't need $1.9 trillion. Total output gap we face is probably a third of that. Some of that is really pandemic driven. It's sort of supply driven. And so I think we need to focus on where the needs are, mainly on extending unemployment benefits. This bill only goes through August. It's probably too high a level, but way too short. Those should be extended further and phased down. More money for testing and tracing, some more for vaccine makes sense. And I think there are other elements of this bill. I do think that states and localities need some aid, but we could easily be doing a bill half the size and still, I think, providing more than enough relief for the economy.
Let's start with this question of size. You know, for years in Washington, that policymakers want to fixate on the top line number and less attention to the elements of the bill. Seems exactly backwards. But in some ways, it seems like a first legacy of the days when Congress cared about paying for tax cuts and spending. Is there a way to get Congress back to focusing on the elements that can best help the economy and see what it costs rather than starting with a line number?
I'm really sorry. This sounds like there's some technical difficulties on my end. I couldn't actually, you sound like a robot to me.
Is that okay? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you a bit.
Okay, let me try one here. Hang on just a second.
I'm told it sounds like a robot to others as well. So it sounds like we're having some technical difficulties. But in the meanwhile, if you put the question in the chat, I'm happy to answer it if I don't sound like a robot.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, good. Okay, let's take it again from the beginning. So what I was asking about is policymakers these days often fixate on that top line number, and they pay less attention to the specific elements of the bill. And this to me seems exactly backwards. And in a funny way, it seems like the perverse legacy of the days when Congress cared about paying for tax cuts and new spending. Is there a way to get Congress to refocus on the specific provisions of bills that can best help the economy and then see what it costs rather than starting with what it costs and filling in the gaps?
Well, look, I actually think both are important. I think that when you're in a deep recession, you do want to figure out what is the total amount of influx the economy needs. What's the total amount that's too much? And probably you want to do somewhere between them. So I think the top down is important, but I also think the bottom up is important. And they did bottom up here, but the problem was in some ways, but the bottom up was often what political commitments have we made? As many of us remember, President Trump demanded $2,000 checks after saying he was going to sign the last bill. And ironically, Democrats ran with that and committed to it in the Georgia election. And so starting with that, that's $400 billion of this package right there for checks. Some of these checks are going to be really important to some folks. But a family of five making $100,000, $150,000 that saw no income loss in the pandemic is going to get another $7,000 of checks. That's a lot of money that doesn't seem like it's necessary. So, I only half accept your premise. I think that in some ways they did start bottom up, in other ways top down, but they didn't start with what do we actually need. And I think the number one thing we actually need is to make sure we have enough unemployment support to make it between now and when the job situation is normal.
So one of the criticisms of focusing so much on unemployment is that it relies on these highly variable state unemployment systems. If you're in the right state, this works smoothly. If you're in the wrong state, you can wait months before you get an unemployment benefit. There's money in these bills to fix the system, the state unemployment systems, but by the time that happens, it's gonna be way too late. So what would you do? How do you get money to people who happen to live in a state where the unemployment system is grossly inefficient?
Sure. Well, this was a huge issue back at the beginning of the pandemic when the states were setting it up, and that was one big reason that I thought the checks back last April and the CARES Act made a lot of sense to give people a bridge. It's not that states have fully fixed this. It's not that this isn't an issue, but most people are now getting a steady stream of unemployment benefits. And the most important thing we can do to make sure they keep getting a steady stream is to pass something ASAP, not force the states to make changes. So every time we have an unemployment cliff and we've got to start over and figure this out again, it's that much more delay in how much and when people are going to get their checks. So I think the best thing we can do is to give states predictable future directives of what to do. The checks can help fill some of the bridges, but they're going to be too little for people that are unemployed that are getting no unemployment benefits, and too much for the vast majority of people. And so I don't see them at this juncture as really a sufficient or adequate bridge for problems with the unemployment systems.
So how would you redesign the checks? How would we call them checks? The payments. Very few people are actually getting checks.
A few
How,
people
how would
get
you
checks.
how would you redesign the payments?
I mean, personally, I don't think that at this juncture we need to have more rebates at all. I think that the rebates made a ton of sense last spring. I think they made some sense for this January. I'm not convinced we need another round. To the extent there is another round, I would do more of them and smaller. So rather than send, a family of five, $7,000 now when we don't really want them fully spending, maybe I'd send them in two or three tranches with some of it as we actually are ready to reopen the economy. And I think we get targeted a lot better. We don't need to be sending checks to families making six figures. This new idea of reducing the top of the phase out doesn't really, get, I think, at the core problem. What we really need to do is reduce the bottom of the phase out. Again, families making $150,000 that haven't experienced any income loss don't really need $7,000 worth of payments.
Senator Manchin reportedly was talking originally about 50,000 is the beginning of the phase out range. Would that have made more sense to you?
I think that would have been a lot more reasonable. I think that the better targeted these checks would be, the better. But again, fundamentally, I don't think it's where we should be prioritizing our dollars.
So you've also talked about phasing out the assistance as the economy improves. Other people have raised this as well. What metrics would you use to determine how the benefits should phase out? Is it employment? Is it changes in state revenues? Is it overall GDP growth? What would you use?
Well, different policies should have different metrics. So let's take the unemployment, for example. Right now, we're paying $300 supplement, which means the average worker is getting about as much on unemployment as they are for working. I think that's reasonable in a pandemic. I actually think it's a little high if we're in a post-pandemic. You don't want to pay people as much not to work as to work. It's hard to tag it to public health, which is maybe what we should do, but to incrementally bring that down based on employment rates. I think employment rather than unemployment, or employment levels, would be ideal. Going off the unemployment rate, I would call good enough. And going off of our best guess of what the unemployment rate will be, I still think is a much better strategy than what we're doing now. We shouldn't be boosting it to 400 and cutting it off in August. Instead, what we should be doing is maintaining the 300 and stair-stepping it down as the economy continues, with some additional benefits, I think, at least through the end of this year.
And would you do this based on a national unemployment rate, or would you try to target this to individual states, for example?
The ideal would be to individual states, but I think we have to match the ideal with the realistic. And so I think a plan that just picked the months in advance based on what we think is going to happen would be much better than the current situation. my ideal design would manage it based on states. Certainly for something like state and local aid, they're doing 2 tranches now. I'd rather do even more tranches, and I'd rather look at something like how's state GDP looking, or how does state personal income looking, to get a sense of what are their potential needs.
I want to get you back to some of the specifics of this, but let's talk a little bit about the overall size again, because that's generated a lot of controversy. Republicans, of course, say it's too big. Even former Clinton Treasury Secretary Larry Summers has said it's too big. So there's a couple of different arguments here I want to unpack. Summers and economists like Olivier Blanchard say it set off a round of inflation. Yet Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who's a former Fed chair, and Jay Powell, who's the current Fed chair, seem unworried about a new relief bill overheating the economy. You seem like you're squarely in the Summers Blanchard camp. Tell us why.
I wouldn't say that. I don't think very high levels of inflation is the top risk here. I think it's a possibility, but I'm not nearly as worried about that as Summers and Blanchard are. I'm more worried about a different kind of overheating, where we get our employment to unsustainable levels, and we set ourselves up for either a hard landing, a crash where we can't maintain this, or the need for constant levels of trillion-dollar packages just to kind of keep the sugar high going. Mostly, I think my base case is, if you spend $1.9 trillion when the economy really only has, say, $600 billion of capacity to grow, I just think it's going to be relatively ineffective. I think we're going to waste the money. It's going to add to the debt without providing that additional boost to the economy. My base case is that it's wasted, not that there's very high rates of inflation, but we need to take the risk of inflation seriously, even if it's only a 10% chance.
So let me ask you about the output gap. You've mentioned this a lot, and you just mentioned it again. Um, you know, how accurate? I mean, we're trying to base this on estimates of the output gap, and even in the best of times, measuring output in the future is awfully hard to do. This is hardly the best of times. Uh, I mean, are we basing this on a kind of a made up number?
We're basing it on an estimate, as everything is, and I think that the output gap is basically based on two components: how much do we think the economy is going to grow absent more stimulus, and how large could it be, our potential GDP and our actual GDP. Both those are highly uncertain. But there's really no measure. If you think that where we were in 2019 was anywhere close to our economic capacity, there's really no measure that we have a output gap, over the next 12 months that's larger than $500 billion, under kind of any real measure. And over the next 3 years, yes, there is more uncertainty, but that uncertainty cuts in both directions. I think it's very plausible that we're essentially facing no output gap by 2022, 2023 without more relief. So this is really pandemic driven. So I do think if you're kind of looking out to that second, or especially that third year, there's more uncertainty, but it goes in both directions. This year, I mean, the economy is already basically within 3% of our pre-pandemic trend, and that's before you account for the shots in people's arms, and what I think we're likely to see this spring, and from the recent package. So yes, there's a lot of uncertainty, but it's really hard for we'd have to be awfully wrong for $1.9 trillion to be justified.
Well, it's interesting. So you look at the analysis, for example, that Wendy Adelberg and Louis Scheiner did at Brookings, and what they found is the economy will run quite hot for 2021 if this thing passes, but that a return to basically, moderate growth a year from now. So I think there's an argument, at least, that can be made that, well, things will be hot for a while, but it's not going to be a big deal. And once the relief bill washes out, that we'll be fine, and that we don't really have anything to worry about. The counter argument, of course, is Democrats are seared by their experience of 10 years ago, and they say we didn't do enough, and look what happened. So why not say, let's err on the side of doing a little too much now and worrying about it later?
So I'm a big believer we should err on the side of doing too much now, which is why I think that $1 trillion makes sense, even though I think 500 billion would probably do the trick. But just because you want to err on the side of too much doesn't mean that you can err infinitively on the side of doing too much. There's a point that it really is just overkill. If you look at the Brookings estimate, they basically conclude a combination of the two theories that I suggested of overheating. One is they lower all their multipliers. They think that when there's this much spent in the economy, it's going to be less effective. So they think that this stimulus, basically this $1.9 trillion stimulus package, is about as effective as a $1.5 trillion stimulus package using their old multiplier. So they do think that it weakens it. And number two, if you look at their estimates, it's not explicit, but really implicit is that jobs unemployment rate gets really low and then jumps pretty high. They assume a soft landing. Even their soft landing looks like the equivalent of a half-point increase in the unemployment rate in a very short period. So their soft landing is pretty harsh, and a harsh landing would be harsher. So I think that I take their estimates as instructive that this package is too large, that it's going to result in it being less effective, and it's going to result in some pain later. Again, unless we decide to avoid that pain by even more deficit spending. And then I worry about the long-term trajectory as that starts to eat away at our capital investment.
So you've been critical of the size of Biden's proposed support for state and local government. He's proposed about $500 billion when you add it all up, including direct aid and funding for schools and transit and the rest. You suggested, or CRP at least has suggested, cutting the amount to about $200 billion. So tell me why.
Yeah, so if you follow my Twitter, you know I've been saying for the last year we need to make sure state and local have the money. That was it wasn't absent. That was always an exaggeration, but there wasn't a lot of state and local money relative to their needs in the earlier packages. But when the data changes, our opinions need to. We've already issued about $360 billion of state and local aid, largely to Medicaid programs and to schools, to some degree to transit. And if you look at overall state and local revenue, in the fourth quarter of last year, on average, if it's past pre-pandemic levels, they've rebounded. This hides big disparities. The oil states and the tourism states are doing quite poorly. Alaska, Hawaii, Florida, Texas are doing very poorly. Nevada. But even there, with oil prices rebounding, I expect the oil states are going to start to recover. And there's just no justification for $500 billion. States like Idaho have their greatest revenue growth in like 50 years. California is facing a $25 billion surplus. We should, again, err on the side of caution. And so I do think sending states $200 billion is reasonable, even though I think that's overkill. Sending them $500 billion is just not justified. And I worry it's going to lead states to do some pretty dumb stuff, like cutting taxes and putting themselves in a worse long-term fiscal position.
So as you've noted, on average, states are doing a lot better than they thought they were going to be doing a year ago. But the average doesn't really matter, right? States don't share money with one another, and you've noted that there are states that are doing well, states that are doing not so well. How would you target the money? Is there a practical way to distribute this money so that the states who need it get it?
So this bill tries to target some by targeting based on their share of the unemployment rate. I think that's very imperfect, but I get what they're trying to do. And I know it's really hard to target it perfectly. Part of the reason I support there's probably only about 60 billion of net state and local need. Part of the reason I support 200 billion is because I know we're not going to target it perfectly. But one thing we could do is we could issue the money in tranches and make that conditional on things like states' level of GDP or states' level of income. And that would be a good proxy, not perfect, but good proxy for what their needs are. I suspect at the end of the day, again, we're looking at fourth quarter of last year. States had recovered. That's before shots were in arms. That's before the effects of the December stimulus bill, let alone the other effects of the stimulus bill. So I suspect at the end of the day, most states are going to be just fine, and we're really going to be down to about 10 states, and mainly the tourism-heavy states that really have heavy need.
So another argument that I hear a lot is there's a lot of variability among cities. There's some cities even within states that are doing quite well, others doing quite poorly. How do you get money to the cities that need the help?
Yeah, so again, the current bill does send money to cities. It uses a combination of existing formulas. I think it's really hard to target it perfectly, but it's really also, again, a handful of cities based on their tax structures or their economic structures that are facing the biggest losses. And we're not going to do this perfectly, whether we send $500 billion or $5. we got to do the best we can, but also understand that some cities may have to modify their tax structures or may need other types of support. It's really hard for me to just justify sending $500 billion, knowing that such a large share of it is going to states and cities that don't need it, that are already experiencing windfalls. If you look at the federal aid we've already sent, state and local income was actually 10% higher in 2020 than 2019. So they're hurting on the underlying basis, but we're already sending them a lot of federal aid. And it's the same thing we're seeing with personal income. Personal income right now is about 12% higher than it was pre-pandemic. And I think we got to pay attention to the data, not just go off our guts, not just say, well, the real problem in the last recession was we let state and localities linger, and so therefore they need $1 trillion. That's just a non sequitur. We need to actually look at the data.
You also have, though, 1 million state and local employees who are still out of work?
About 1.3 million, but I tried to compare this. There's no relationship between the revenue losses in the states and the job losses. In fact, if you were to force to draw a line, the states with the biggest revenue losses have the smallest job losses. And so while I suspect some of this is states worried about revenue losses, I think a lot of these jobs are lost because they're not needed during a pandemic. If your schools are shut down, you don't need custodial staff. If you have state and local buildings that are shut down, you don't need people working in those buildings. So I suspect a lot of this is not really money related. And if you do the math, $500 billion times $1.3 million jobs is like $400 thousand per job. And we're not even making the states commit to rehiring. With PPP, we said small businesses have to rehire their workers. So I find this argument to be relatively unconvincing, even though I do very much worry about those jobs and think we need to have a good plan to try to get them back.
So more broadly, going back to Larry Summers, he makes a political point as well as his economic point. He strongly has, and for years now, has strongly supported a big stimulus plan, which would follow this relief bill. But he worries that an overstuffed bill now would constrain lawmakers as they consider more spending for infrastructure and other things that he likes. So 2 questions. First of all, do you support the idea of a more traditional stimulus bill once the pandemic is controlled? And second, do you agree with his political analysis? The money we spend now won't be available to spend later.
I think this was the opportunity to do a relief and recovery. We chose to frame it around things that are more reliefy, but the fact is they're going to more than fill the output gap on our output needs. So unless there's a big change in the national stimulus bill after this, would make a lot of sense. I do think we need more infrastructure, and especially focused on green infrastructure. But there are many ways to finance that. My favorite being a carbon tax. It's a sort of a win-win. We can promote green advancements of green technology in the private sector and use it to fund it in the public sector. But the president supported things like raising the corporate rate. I think there's lots of ways to finance infrastructure that would be a lot more pro-growth than trying to borrow when we already have an economy that's at or above its capacity.
So you also you've criticized provisions of the bill that you say may have merit, but don't belong in this bill because they're not really pandemic related. So that would be things like the child tax credit, the earned income credit, like that. The counter argument, of course, is that parents of children are among those who are hardest hit in the pandemic. So shouldn't they benefit from at least a temporary bump in these benefits?
Well, look, if the real goal here was just to help parents of children, we would take the $1,400 economic impact payment that's going to children and bump it up to $2,400 or $3,400. If that was the overriding goal, they would get that money next month. That's not the overriding goal here. The overriding goal here is to put in place a permanent expansion of the child tax credit 1 year at a time. And I'm very sympathetic to that. I think the child allowance would dramatically reduce child poverty, has all sorts of benefits. But at best, that money is going to start flowing in July. And I'm very skeptical much of it's going to flow in 2021 at all. This isn't really about the pandemic. It's about getting a child allowance in effect. And I'm not even so bothered by it being in this bill, but it shouldn't get the same sort of pay-go exemption that everything gets. They should pay for it. And there's plenty of options. A 1 point increase in the corporate rate could pay for 1 year of this child allowance.
So this kind of raises a political question. This isn't really about economics, it's about politics. So, Democrats say, wait a minute, in 2017, the economy was doing pretty well. We passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We cut taxes mostly for high income individuals and businesses by $1.5 trillion. Nobody was worried about paying for it. Now they say we're going to provide some assistance through tax cuts and other benefits for low and moderate income people, and suddenly people are wringing their hands and saying we ought to pay for it. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think the literally 100, we counted them, 100 press releases, papers, and blogs that we wrote screaming that they should pay for the 2017 tax cuts and telling them how kind of counters that argument. I think the 3,000 press appearances we had making the same. I think the many sleepless nights and hours I spent on the Hill and elsewhere. The Committee for Responsible Federal Budget spent 6 months of our lives only focused on trying to get them to pay for the 2017 tax cuts. And we had some successes on the margins in improving the bill, but sadly we failed, and the deficit financed it anyway. I'm not of the camp that two wrongs make a right, and they shouldn't have deficit financed the tax cuts in 2017. That was a huge mistake. And they shouldn't deficit finance tax cuts, permanent tax cuts or changes in policies going forward. An eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind, and we got to put an end to this madness at some point.
But how do we do it?
That's, I wish I had the answer to that. That's the $22 trillion question that if I could answer, I think would make all of our lives a lot better.
It's interesting, Mark. In my intro, I mentioned your work on both Simpson and later on the Joint Select Committee. They were 10 years ago, but it seems like a lifetime ago. Now it's hard to find a single member of Congress of either party who really cares about the budget deficit or the debt. Republicans, when they're out, say they care. Now they're worried about it because they're afraid Democrats can spend too much. Democrats never really care. So how does this change? What has to happen for people to worry about deficits and debt again?
Yeah, I don't agree with you that Democrats never really care. I think a lot of Democrats really do care about the deficit and debt, including the president. I think he's on record, but everyone is weighing how much they care about deficit and debt against their other priorities. And a problem is more often than not, the other priorities win. My boss, the chair of our committee, Leon Panetta, President Clinton's chief of staff and President Obama's Secretary of Defense, says that you either govern by leadership or by crisis. And we're just not seeing any leadership. So that only leaves one option, sadly. And I really hope he's wrong.
So what's the crisis?
The one I worry about the most is the invisible crisis, where we continue to borrow. We continue to erode our fiscal capacity because the money we spent in interest. We continue to erode our economic capacity because people are buying those bonds instead of investing in the sector. The economy grows 0.2% slower year to year, which nobody notices, but accumulates. And 30 years down the line, everybody's income is $8,000 lower per person than otherwise would be. That's the one I worry about because we maybe never get change. Corporate crises are possible. We may overplay our hands here and see a big run up in inflation, something Larry Summers is worried about. We could, I don't see this in the near term, but we could ultimately run into a fiscal crisis. We're not going to default. We printed our own currency, but that doesn't mean that a sharp spike in interest rates couldn't cause a sell-off around the world and bring down the global financial system. So I worry about some of these possibilities, but I'm most fearful in some ways about this incremental crisis that we don't see until it's too late.
So we have just about a minute left, but I want to ask you about this. So Summers and Jason Furman have argued that we're in this period of secular low interest rates, and what we should be worrying about is government interest payments, not government debt. And with interest rates so low and no prospect they'll rise anytime soon, it's acceptable to let the debt continue to rise to fund government investment. So, what do you say? We're in a period of low interest rates, gone on for 30 years now.
Yeah. What's amazing is that despite the fact that interest rates are like a quarter of what they were 15 years ago, interest payments are just as high. And the reason is that our debt is growing. The problem with, As a technical matter, they're right. What really matters for fiscal sustainability is your interest to your revenue, not your debt to GDP. The problem is that interest and revenue can both move rapidly. Interest can change very quickly for interest rates. Revenue can change because of policy. And so debt to GDP is in some ways a better proxy of your interest risk and of your revenue risk than interest to revenue is. And so, yes, our interest payments matter, but our debt tells us what our potential interest payments are. And if interest rates jump just 1%, we have 4 trillion more of debt over the next decade. And that's something we need to worry about.
Well, Mark, we're out of time. Thanks very much. I know you want to get onto C-SPAN and listen to the clerk of the Senate read the bill. So thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to our audience. And we'll see everybody next time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.